Hi everybody, so my name's Charlie Dorr. I'm a researcher in residence on the Plymouth Health Determinants Research Collaboration, a partnership between the University of Plymouth, Plymouth City Council, who are the lead, and Plymouth Octopus Project, which looks to undertake research and use evidence to address health inequalities and the determinants of health inequalities in the city. I'm here doing a training presentation to two members of staff at Plymouth City Council, Nikki and Kira, and it's about doing scoping reviews, part one, and with a particular focus on explaining scoping reviews and how you can do them to local authority, staff and partners in the voluntary and community sector. Okay, I've got quite a few slides which I'll go through, and I can go to the next one. Okay, so here are the learning outcomes. So first of all, we want to cover understanding what a scoping review is and how it relates to and is different to other types of literature review. So as soon as you get into the world of literature reviews and evidence reviews, you come up with lots of different terms. So it'd be good to cover a few of them today. Secondly, to understand the first steps in the scoping review process, from design all the way through to screening. And we'll cover a little bit of the last steps, but that'll be mainly left to another session. And then finally, I'll also include some information about where you can go for further details. So that's just a more detailed overview of the steps that we'll go through during this session. So we'll talk about why do we need to do literature reviews, first of all, and then the different types of literature reviews, and then the process, and we'll sort of run through each of those steps as well. So why review the literature? Why look at research literature? Why not just do a research study straight away? Well, it's important to look through what research already exists for a topic, if there's an area, an issue that you're interested in, partly because an awful lot of research has been undertaken, and it's not always obvious or clear, even to academics, let alone to policymakers or practitioners in an area, what research has already been carried out. So to avoid the danger of reinventing the wheel and going ahead and doing a research project, it's important to see what else has actually been undertaken in that area. Is there already research findings that you could use and you could apply to a policy decision or to an area of practice if you were aware of it? Reviewing the literature is a great way to ensure your policy and process decisions are informed by the most comprehensive and best quality evidence possible. So you can identify what's the best practice in a particular area and what works and what doesn't work. And it's also useful for identifying what gaps in the literature exist. So understanding not just what research has been undertaken in a particular area, but also where there is a need for more research. And if you are thinking about doing any research study, it's good to actually see what existing work's been undertaken. And then that can also inform the development of your research project itself. So you can identify those gaps, identify those methods that were used, and then use them to inform your own planning. And then there's the different types of literature reviews. So now I need to caveat this a little bit in that for some of these definitions, especially those that are become more recently popular, which includes scoping reviews, you will sometimes come across different definitions used by different organizations. So the less, in general, the more recent a review is, the less structured it is, the more grey, more a grey area the definition might be, and you may find overlaps between different types of reviews. This first type of review, those systematic reviews, is fairly universally acknowledged as having a very there's a very strong consensus about what systematic reviews are. So they're replicable, transparent processes to answer a specific research question. And the idea is to review the literature in an exhaustible way, so there's nothing that you leave out that's potentially relevant. To create an audit trail that other researchers can then use, so it's very transparent. And also assess the quality of that literature as well. So an important part of a systematic review is to do a quality appraisal to see, how good are each of these studies, and that could be things like, how good was their recruitment, did they have a control group, how was that recruited, did they control for different things that could have an impact on the particular thing that was being researched. So these are particularly used in certain areas like medicine. So they're very useful when you've got a specific intervention, like a vaccine, for example, and you want to see what the benefits of that intervention are. In those sort of cases, systematic reviews are very important. And they can be used to recommend sort of clinical outcomes. So you may have a systematic review of randomized controlled trials in a particular medical drug, and that could actually be used as a way to determine whether that drug should be bought and recommended by NICE, for example. They're very resource intensive to do, so in general, it's not something that local authorities are likely to use or commission themselves, but it's good to be aware of, because local authorities could well use the results of systematic reviews, particularly in certain areas like public health. And another definition that comes up is umbrella reviews, which are reviews of systematic reviews themselves. So you can have a review of research studies, and then you can have a review of reviews of research studies, and that's what an umbrella review is. Sort of closely related concept is the meta-analysis. This is where you've got a large number of quantitative studies, and there's enough similarity and homogeneity between what they're looking at, between the outcomes that they're assessing, that you could actually statistically combine the results to look at the impact. Say, if there are a number of studies that were on a particular drug, you could combine the results from that study to do a meta-analysis and look at the actual effectiveness of that drug. So again, they tend to be used a lot in the medical sphere. They're closely linked to systematic reviews. Basically, if a systematic review is just using quantitative studies, and that would tend to be RCTs, so randomized controlled trials, then you may use a meta-analysis to bring the findings together. They do have a bit of a drawback, though, that you will only tend to be looking at, well, you'll only be looking at research that's been published, and there is a difficulty that sometimes comes about because academics don't necessarily publish studies if the study hasn't found a significant effect. So that's what's called the file draw problem, where a non-significant effects are not included in a review. So going to the sort of other end of the spectrum from systematic reviews, which are really structured, really robust, very transparent, very step by step. You have narrative reviews, which are very common, if not the most common review, and they're much more informal, wider in scope, less focused in systematic reviews, not unlike the sort of literature review you might do at university, say in preparation for a dissertation. They're often gained to give an initial impression of a subject, and the criteria for what studies you include and exclude tend to be much less explicit. But they can be useful for practitioners and policymakers as well, just to give you information about a topic and some of the key research and the key findings that have been undertaken. So the next one, the one we're going to focus on, is scoping reviews. And one way of sort of looking at them is that they do fall between systematic and narrative reviews, although somewhat closer in some respects to systematic reviews. So they basically aim to systematically identify and map the breadth of evidence in a particular topic. So they're more structured, rigorous and transparent than a narrative review. They include some of the steps that you will have in a systematic review, but they're less resource and time intensive than a systematic review. The difficulty with them is that you couldn't use them to recommend particular treatments or particular interventions, so because they're not as robust as systematic reviews. In the clinical sort of context, they tend to serve as a prelude to systematic reviews. So you might undertake a scoping review around a particular intervention and then use that mapping work that you've done to then actually design your systematic review. But outside of clinical research, they can be used to understand the impact of a policy, and the volume of evidence available, and they can address more open-ended questions than a systematic review. Slightly confusing things a little bit is a related concept, which is the rapid review. Now, this is a tricky one to define, because sometimes when people talk about rapid reviews, they will literally be talking about something which is a bit like a quick narrative review. Someone, an academic or someone involved in a public organization might undertake a quick review of what literature is around, within a matter of days, just to get an idea of a particular topic area. That's something actually that I've done in certain contexts. For some organizations, there is a bit more of a specific definition of a rapid review. So a National Collaborating Centre for Methods and Tools has a definition of a rapid systematic review, and DEFRA have a particular definition as well of rapid evidence reviews. And in this context, they're quite similar to scoping reviews. They use some of the structure of systematic reviews, but are shorter and not as extensive. The main difference with scoping reviews is that they tend to include a quality appraisal of the research. So they'll actually look at the quality of the individual studies as well as the findings from those studies. They'll also look at the quality of the methods within those studies. Okay, so that's an overview of some of the types of literature review. So now I'm going to focus on the key steps of the scoping review process. So we'll start. One of the ways in which you might start is you may have a sort of general idea for a research topic or question, but it's good to look before you actually do a scoping review. It's actually good to check whether any reviews have been undertaken already. So we'll cover preliminary searches, then to develop your question. As with systematic reviews, in a scoping review process, you'll also decide an inclusion and exclusion criteria, and this will be really important for when you decide what research literature to include in the review and what to exclude. And that's also doubly important because however good your search techniques are, you will always get lots of research studies which won't be relevant to you. So it's important to be able to have robust inclusion and exclusion criteria. The next process, once you've actually designed your question and you've got your inclusion and exclusion criteria, I should say as well that by this point you'll have at least a draft protocol, which is something that we designed for the retrofitting project. But the next stage will be to design some search criteria and then select some databases to search those criteria, which we'll cover shortly. Then after you've completed the search and removed the duplicates, the next stage is to do some pilot screening. So where you can get together as a research team and just check your criteria for including, excluding, try to apply it to some of the articles and discuss what you think how you think they apply. So you can take a particular article and you can look at it, and each of you can decide whether or not you would include and exclude that article, and you can then discuss the reasons. And that's a great way of developing an understanding of how you're applying the protocol to the actual screening process. Then the next stage after that is title abstract screening, which I'll explain in more detail soon, but it's basically running through each of the abstracts you'll have identified, and again including and excluding them, and that's done individually, and then looking at the full text of each of the papers of those that are included as a result of the title and abstract screening. And then there's a couple more stages after that. So data extraction, which we won't really go into much detail here, but this is when once you've actually screened all the articles, and once you've done the full text screening, so you've taken the included articles from the title and abstract screening, you've screened each of their full text, and those that you've decided to include, you can then do data extraction of. So you will extract the data that is relevant to your review. So that could be things like the findings from each of those papers, and potentially also information about the methods as well, depending on what you're looking at in your protocol. And once you've extracted it all the information from the relevant studies, there's then a process of analysis and synthesis. So bringing together the data from each of the included papers or reports that you reviewed, and actually analyzing them to find out what they're actually telling you, and finally, of course, reporting on that. There are more stages in other types of reviews. So I did mention quality appraisal as a stage in systematic reviews as well. So, but these are the sort of main stages for the scoping review. Just to say, today we're going to be focusing on these two columns. So everything from sort of preliminary searches through to title and abstract screening. And then we'll cover the others later on. And just a caveat, in real life, it's really as linear as this. So often these different boxes will sort of overlap and cross into each other. So, you will start your question development before you do your preliminary search, because you'll have some idea of what your research question is, even though your preliminary search will may affect that question. Quite often, data extraction analysis often ends up getting somewhat combined, because you can't help analyzing stuff while you're extracting data. So yeah, this linear model gives an idea of how a scoping review takes place, but it can be a little more messy sometimes. So just to cover the preliminary searches, so Nikki and Kira, you've done some of this already. So you've got your research question. In our case, it was what's the impact? What's the best way to sort of use what are the approaches to targeting retrofitting interventions at people who are in fuel poverty and have significant health issues? And we looked at looked to see if there were potential scoping reviews and systematic reviews already out there, and there are different databases you can use. The Cochrane library is really useful as a approach to seeing the systematic reviews, because that includes a database of them. Similarly, the JBI systematic review register is also another good place to look. And the Open Science Framework is also something to be recommended, because it also includes registrations. So people that are in the process, academics or others who are in the process of doing a scoping or a systematic review, may have registered their study there. And that's useful because not all studies will be published yet. So then the next thing is, once you've done your preliminary research, is to think about developing your research questions. So as I say, you may already have a general idea what your research question is, but it's good to think about how you can make it a bit more specific and structured, because that's going to be really important when you actually do the scoping review. So here are some characteristics of a good research question. Ensuring it's clear, intelligible, it's something that can be researched, got connections with established theory, and it can be linked to other research questions, and it's an original contribution, so not just repeating a previous question. So you want to consider the breadth and focus of the question. So scoping reviews tend to have broader and more explorative questions than systematic reviews. So systematic review would have a very sort of specific question, such as, does this intervention X lead to this outcome Y? And that will basically be the main focus, and you wouldn't want to depart from that question. In a scoping review, it is a bit more open-ended. You should have expectations for how you apply the findings, and you also might want to consider different ways to structure the research questions. The two suggestions here actually relate to systematic review frameworks, so but they could potentially be used in a scoping review. So one, which is PICO, which is where you select your patient population, your intervention, your comparison, and your outcomes. That is very much for quantitative studies. And the other one, which is SPICE, which is very much focused on what particular settings and what particular perspectives people have, is more for qualitative reviews. So if we just take the example of our own research question around retrofitting. So this was about how should retrofitting interventions aimed at low-income households be best targeted to facilitate fuel poverty alleviation, improved energy efficiency, and better health outcomes. So we've got our intervention here, which is retrofitting. So it's retrofitting schemes. We will need to define that, but that doesn't need to be done in the research question itself. We've got a population, low-income households. And we've got outcomes. We've actually got a few outcomes here, because we've got fuel poverty alleviation, improved energy efficiency, and better health outcomes. And as well as that, we also need to decide on inclusion and exclusion criteria. So, these can be used for two purposes. Firstly, the actual search, so it can inform the search terms that you choose, and it can be used. It be used either by yourself or by someone like an information specialist when the search is undertaken, because the different databases where the research studies can be found will have their own filtering options. So you could have, for example, studies of people above or below a certain age, and you could actually have a filter for that in some search databases. But also this is used in the screening process as well, so it can help you to include and exclude studies on the basis of their relevance. One option also is to categorize inclusion and exclusion criteria using frameworks like PICO or SPICE. It's a few things that's useful to consider. One of the most important ones is around the need to balance between sensitivity, so maximizing the most relevant results, and precision, so minimizing irrelevant results. So as I mentioned, there's going to be a lot of studies. However good your search strategy is, there's inevitably going to be a large number of studies, probably the large majority, that you'll exclude during the screening. And that's because if you make your criteria too specific, you'll actually end up excluding really relevant studies. So it's trying to get a good balance right. You don't want to have a situation where your search criteria is so broad and your inclusion and exclusion criteria is so broad that you will end up with a huge number of studies to screen and then do data extraction with, and many of them aren't relevant. But at the same time, you don't want a situation where you're so specific that you've got hardly any studies to look at and they don't really answer your question because there are important studies that you've excluded. So yeah, the key thing is getting that balance right. And there's a few other things that you can consider, like where is the research being undertaken? So, what country, are you interested in research that's been undertaken outside the UK? Are you interested in research in the developing world or just the developed world? And, the language, do you just want studies in English? All those things need to sort of be considered. And then once you've got your question, you've got your inclusion and exclusion criteria, the next thing is think about search terms. So this is the actual terms that will be used in the search for research papers. And there it's a case of thinking about how best to create search terms that fit your research questions. So using your question and your inclusion criteria, you can create a list of search terms. You can also use your existing knowledge. You can use literature from the preliminary search also to help. One useful tip for developing search terms is to look at the keywords that may come up in articles that you're already familiar with. So if you know that there are a few say research studies on prioritizing retrofitting, you can use keywords from those articles. Normally most articles have keywords, so they'll have particular keywords which are designed to help people search and locate those articles. And if you then borrow those keywords and use them in your search criteria, you're more likely to come up with similar articles. And you've also got to take into account there may be different terms for the same thing. So recently I've been doing a scoping review around intellectual disabilities, and of course there are different terms for intellectual disabilities, one obvious one being learning disabilities. So when you're designing your list of search terms, it's good to think about all the other terms that might be used for that same thing. So is sort of retrofitting the only term that's going to be used? Do we need to think about other terms like renovation or more specific terms? So those sort of things need to be considered. This is just the example from our own retrofitting review, more for people watching this. So so we had terms based on the intervention: home retrofit, insulation, clean energy. We had a concept, so what is it that we want to find out about those interventions? So in this case, it's how they targeted, how they prioritized. I should say the little asterisk is a case that in some databases, it's used in some databases. It basically means you don't need to worry about whether someone put targeting or targeted or target or prioritizing, prioritized or priority. The asterisks will help pick up those other terms. And there's also the outcome, the impact. So we've got health inequalities, equality. These are just examples. It's not the whole, not all the search terms. And then the context. So there's going to be lots of articles about retrofitting public buildings, for example, but we've got to limit it to residential properties, so houses, bungalows, mobile homes. And then the process is to identify databases. So we didn't really need to worry about this with the retrofitting study because we had our information specialist who, so while we could recommend certain areas to her, she was able to also target them. But these are some of the databases that you could use. Scopus is a very important one. Web of Science is very useful for science and technology. Scopus is a bit more useful for social science. Green file is quite relevant for retrofitting because there's environmental literature there. EBSCO Business Source Complete is useful, as the name would imply, for business-related research, although it's also a platform that can be used for searching other databases like Medline. And from a sort of health perspective, Ovid and PubMed are useful platforms for searching medical research databases like Medline and CINAHL. And of course, there's also Google Scholar. Having said all that, it's also important not to forget grey literature. So as well as doing an academic search, it's also a useful thing to do a grey literature search on Google, particularly for any sort of reports or useful research that hasn't been published academically. So it won't necessarily come up in academic databases, but it could potentially come up from a Google search. And that's kind of a useful tip, as particularly for local authorities and voluntary sector organisations if they're engaging in searches. Just to say as well, in terms of the access to articles, so if you're searching for particular articles, normally you can get the abstract, and the title is going to be freely available, and you'll be able to just read the abstract. And in the early stage of your screening process, that's all you'll need to do. But at some point, for those included papers, you are going to need to look at their the full text of those research studies. So it's worth sort of covering a little bit about this, particularly for people from local authorities and other organisations that might not be so familiar with it. So a lot of our academic articles are behind sort of paywalls on subscription journals. However, increasingly more of them are being open access. So open access is where they're accessible and downloadable free of charge. So you can download your paper and basically review it, and you can keep hold of it. They're usually represented by this little symbol, orange symbol here, or something similar. Yeah, more articles are in that situation now. But for many articles, they still will be behind paywalls, and that's where it can be a bit of a challenge. If you've got an HDRC, as we have, then it'd be good to, we'd recommend you speak to representatives from that, because the HDRCs are partnerships with universities, and universities like the University of Plymouth will have subscriptions to a lot of journals, and so are much more likely to be able to get those articles that are behind paywalls for free. Another option that you could potentially look at as well are interlibrary loans. There is, this is just for Plymouth City Council staff, but there is also a link I've included in the slide, which is to further information about sourcing articles and papers for literature reviews. Another key point to mention as well is around record keeping. So when you search for literature, it's important to keep a record of all the terms you've used, all the databases searched, and any filtering you've done. So by country, by date. You may have only filtered for studies after, for example, the year 2000 or 2010, or even later. It's good to keep a record of all of that. That's part of what makes a review more systematic, more structured, and more robust. And it's good to do this for both academic and grey literature, and you can just use Excel to record. Then there's a question about managing the results. So there's a number of databases where you can do this. So when you've done your search, you'll actually have potentially hundreds, even thousands of abstracts coming back for you to do a screening review of. And you'll need a platform or a database to actually look through them. EndNote is a really useful platform that exists. We have it with us in the University of Plymouth, but you can get a free online EndNote basic version, which does enable you to organize reference lists and create bibliographies. That is free. Another platform we sometimes use is Rayan. That's a systematic review management platform, and that's really useful if you're doing systematic reviews because it enables you to do double-blind screening, which is where you could have, say, two reviewers looking at the same articles, the same papers, but they can't see what the other person's decisions are. So they're not going to be swayed by the other person's decision. They're not going to think, oh, I'm going to exclude this article because that other person has done so. And that then makes it independent, which fits the methodology of a systematic review. And there is a free version, I believe, as well for early career researchers for Rayan, with allowing limited use, although I don't know the full details about that. Platforms can also be useful to deduplicate. So when we go back to the question around databases, there are a large number of academic databases available. And they will include some of the same research, so you will get duplication in your search results. And one of the advantages of using platforms like EndNote and Rayan is they can do some automatic deduplication of those results. And I would suggest PCC staff, if they're embarking on this, to just contact the HDRC if they need any support. So this is going to be particularly useful for Kira and Nikki, because this is the sort of next few stages for our scoping review around retrofitting, is the screening process. So, as I say, the screening process is basically about deciding what articles you've done your searching, you've identified articles on the basis of your search criteria, and this is about trying to decide which of those articles is relevant and which of those articles you don't need to look at anymore. And that's two stages. The first is to look at the title and abstracts of all the articles you have, and the second stage is where you take those titles and abstracts that you want to include because they meet your inclusion criteria and don't fall foul of your exclusion criteria. And this involves reviewing the full text papers. Now, I mentioned this can be different depending on the type of review. So, as I say, in systematic reviews, you'd normally have an independent double-blind, double screening process where you'd have at least two reviewers and they wouldn't be able to see what the other reviewer is rating. Scoping reviews, it's not necessarily blind and the process is more varied. It's also, as I mentioned earlier, useful to pilot the approach first for a scoping review. So actually have a meeting of the research team and just try a few screening attempts together just to get an idea what other people would include and exclude and see how the inclusion and exclusion criteria work. So in order to be included, each paper being reviewed needs to fit at least one of the inclusion criteria. So this particular example was to do with one of the studies I've been working on around learning disabilities, where we included different types of study that had a focus on engaging individuals with intellectual disability, and you notice got / learning disability because there are different terms for the same thing. And we were interested in what the barriers and facilitators were of their research engagement. So we include all the different types of studies that we wanted to include, so empirical studies, evaluations, reflective papers, and then we also include some exclusion criteria as well. So, excuse me, so we didn't want studies that weren't with people who have an intellectual disability. So if there were studies around research engagement, but they were with other groups of people, say people with physical disabilities, then they wouldn't be included if they didn't say anything about people with intellectual disabilities. Okay, so just coming back after a impromptu break. Yeah, the final point I just wanted to make about this the exclusion criteria in this particular study was that it related to excluding papers which didn't involve people with intellectual disabilities, anything beyond being research subjects. And this is not the place to really go into much detail, but about that. But it's a specific criteria that was used for that paper. Just to say, so while we were having a quick break, there was a question that I had as well, just about the earlier databases mentioned. In one of the slides, I talked about places like Cochrane and JBI, and in a later slide, I talked about Scopus and Web of Science. So the first set of databases was more around databases where you will find other pre-existing scoping and systematic reviews. And that's basically for trying to understand what reviews of research have already been undertaken in a particular area, whereas the latter set of databases, so things like Scopus and Web of Science, are more about where you actually find the research that reviews are based on. So these, you may find scoping reviews or systematic reviews in Web of Science and Scopus. In fact, you will do, but you'll also find lots of primary research. So you'll find studies where they interviewed people, surveyed people, engaged them in clinical trials, if that's an area of risk of this that relates to the topic you're doing. You'll find all sorts of different research designs. You'll find studies of all sorts of research designs in those databases. So I just wanted to explain that and clarify about that. Just to go back to inclusion and exclusion criteria, so this is the example from the retrofitting scoping review, and there we divided it up on the basis of participants, concept and context. So we wanted to, this is a bit like PICO, but it's a bit less specific because it wasn't a systematic review. So we were interested in studies which basically considered how best to prioritize retrofitting interventions. And it's important to define our participants. So we were interested in studies where retrofitting is promoted to people on low household incomes and people with serious physical or mental health conditions. And the concept was home retrofitting and home retrofitting schemes. So home retrofitting is defined here. Improvements to improve energy efficiency or produce clean energy. And retrofitting schemes is defined as schemes set up to specifically deliver home retrofitting interventions. And you can see the importance of these aspects of the inclusion criteria in the screening process, and that you will find quite a lot of studies about retrofitting which are about retrofitting buildings rather than about residences. So it's important to have these sorts of inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria to make sure you don't end up including those. And then the final one was around context, and we only looked at UK and EU studies after 2000, and that's something that will largely have been filtered out by the screening process because it's quite easy to filter for those things in search databases. But it's possible, especially through grey literature searching, that you might come up with some studies which don't fit within that context. So just wanted to give just a few examples of the screening process based on abstracts that have been identified through our search. So this one here is actually the first abstract that came up in the search. So it's from a magazine called The Ecologist. It's in 2007, so it was after our cutoff point of 2000. And we can just identify certain aspects of the abstract. So if you read through the abstract, and then I've highlighted a few key things that are potentially important to whether it's included or excluded. So first of all, in terms of participants, now they don't necessarily fit the criteria. They're homeowners. Now they could fit the criteria because you have have homeowners in low-income households or with mental and physical health conditions, but doesn't precisely fit that criteria. So a judgment call might need to be made in terms of how precisely you're going to apply your inclusion and exclusion criteria, and whether you want to get the full text of an article to see whether it's more specific than that. It may consider cost effectiveness. So in this abstract, you talk about how a change in British government policy, albeit back in 2007, had an impact on the cost effectiveness of retrofitting. So that does have some relevance to what we're looking at, but it doesn't actually say it's about prioritizing retrofitting. So there's a bit of ambiguity about its relevance there. But the reason why I would actually exclude this one is actually to do with the type of abstract it is. So if you see here, the publisher is The Ecologist. It's not an academic journal, it's actually a magazine. And the way in which it's worded suggests it's actually a news article. Now, in this particular case, I did actually go to a link and just checked it out. And actually, the abstract is not really an abstract. It is actually just everything that is actually it is actually the whole text. So there isn't any more information, really, much more information that we could even get from that anyway. So in this case, it would be excluded. I'll take a different example next, which is from definitely from an academic article, which is by a team led by someone called Apakirsh, and it's titled Sustainability Insights on Emerging Solar District Heating Technologies to Boost the Nearly Zero Energy Building Concept. So just again, read through the whole abstract and then just select certain bits which are related to the inclusion exclusion criteria. Or one is it relates to the residential sector, so it's not about the building, it's not about the commercial sector, which was which would have potentially excluded it. Doesn't necessarily fit the participant inclusion criteria though, because it could be it's not necessarily aimed at participant and aimed at residences where there are people in low incomes or with health conditions. It's relevant to the decision making around the technology choice, so but it's not around the allocation of funding. So there's a lot of stuff here around influencing the decision making of stakeholders and policymakers, and they've actually looked at the potential improvements delivered by this intervention compared to the alternative, which in this case is decentralized heat pump. But they don't look at the allocation of a particular fund. So it's not looking at how retrofitting could best meet particular groups of people. It's more looking about what particular technology you use in retrofitting. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to go ahead just then, but I have to say that this is my thoughts based on this abstract, and as part of a research team, there may be different people who have different views and think it should be included, and that's why it's always useful if you can to have a second person to actually look at the abstract. And then potentially, if there's conflicts, have a third person to make the final decision. So that's just gives you a bit of a highlight of the screening process, and nearly through with the presentation. So I just want to highlight some of the next steps. So after you've screened all the abstracts, you then go to full text screening, which so you read each of the articles you decided to include. Now, you might think I've excluded 2 abstracts there. Which ones are we going to include? Those were the first 2 that I basically chose from the abstracts that have been collected by us. Most abstracts you would be likely to exclude, and you would probably have a significant problem if you were including more abstracts than you were excluding. And that relates to the point that if you make the search criteria too narrow, you'll probably end up excluding very relevant papers. So once you've got your list of included abstracts, you will then need to source the full text and then screen each of these. So you may find that some of those texts don't turn out to be eligible when you actually have a look at the full text. Then the next stage after that is to do data extraction, which is when you actually start to get the data from each of those papers that you have decided to include following full text screening, and you're basically extracting the data that is relevant. And normally you'll use a data extraction form, which I can show an example of in the next session. But I've got a link here to a template which the JBI have created. And then after that, there's the question there's the stage of analyzing and synthesizing the data. So that's pretty much it for the first stage. There are some useful resources as well. So the JBI have a scoping review network, and there are a lot of resources on the JBI website, so that's worth checking out. DEFRA produced, it's a little bit old now, but DEFRA produced a guide on quick scoping reviews and rapid evidence assessments, which could be beneficial. There's also some links specifically for Plymouth City Council staff on the council intranet, produced by the HDRC. So my colleague Lorna Burns has done some slides on doing systematic reviews, which also talks a bit about the different types of reviews as well, a bit like this presentation. And you can find her slides, which are really good, on the HDRC intranet, and you can also find some guidance that has been produced specifically for PCC staff members. And then finally, we've just got a few references and bibliography there that might be of interest. Brilliant. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll end this